Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to discuss the War of 1812. We've been setting the stage for this conflict since more or less the beginning of this unit, so we're going to dive in and get it over with, and try to talk about how the quote-unquote Second War for Independence started and then unfolded. So, let's dive in. Here are our basic objectives for today, and here we are. So as we talked about previously, Madison's presidency was mostly defined by trying to deal with the crises, both in the West through Tecumseh's War and, of course, with the whole impressment controversy. There were a number of ways in which Madison tried to deal with the impressment controversy. We have, upon his election, he repealed the embargo and tried to trade with everyone who's not Britain and France, which is the Non-Intercourse Act. But of course, as we remember from the map from last class, as far as what the status of Europe was, pretty much everyone had been forced to take sides in the Napoleonic Wars, and so this wasn't feasible. And then Macon's Bill No. 2 restored trade with both, if both respected neutral rights, which neither of them did, but in the end, it was more of a salutary neglect type thing that, there's really nothing we can do about this. This war in Europe is going to be disrupting our trade. Attempting to enforce any type of embargo is, more or less counterproductive. And so as a result of this whole deal, the crisis continued to grow. You can see that trade somewhat recovered here after up until Macon's Bill No. 2, where it dropped off a little bit again, but in general, it fell off pretty substantially from its pre-embargo height. In the end, the other problem that we had, of course, is Tecumseh. Tecumseh was still out there, still growing in strength. The Prophetstown had been destroyed, as we talked about last time, but our continuing fear of a British alliance led the war hawks, which we're going to talk about in a moment, the people who were pushing for war, to argue for a more aggressive response to the Native American problem along the frontiers. So, people who were opposed to the war argued that this is just an unnecessary land grab. Tecumseh and his coalition were already weakened by the whole Battle of Tippecanoe, and that speculators and, pro-war forces would be the only beneficiaries of this. So the war hawks had a number of different reasons why they argued that we should go to war. Part of it is competition with the fur trade in Native Americans, although that was a much lesser piece of it. Expansionist sentiment in Congress was pretty large. We were very, very concerned about Tecumseh and a British alliance, although that was, looking back on the historical records, that was probably more in our imagination than it was an actual, real thing that could happen, because, as we hopefully remember, the British are pretty preoccupied with Napoleon. The blockade is a huge problem, and then, of course, impressment of American sailors is a huge blow to American prestige, especially when they're attacking U.S. Navy ships right off of our coast. So for all these reasons, the war hawks started pushing for war. One of the strongest proponents of war is a new face here, one of our second generation of American politicians, Henry Clay of Kentucky. So here he's describing, using a sort of similar to Thomas Paine's style, common sense arguments, that in general, we should go and fight, and we need to prepare ourselves, and that, we'd be easily able to defeat the Native Americans the same way we defeated the forces at Tippecanoe, and therefore, we should push for war. So Henry Clay, as we see here on the right, of Kentucky, is one of our war hawks. He's going to be one of the politicians known as the triumvirate, who are going to be really important going forward through the rest of this unit. He's going to, in general, represent the western United States. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina is also going to be for the war, mostly be pro-American prestige and also pushing back on Native Americans sort of in the southwest part of the United States. So the war hawks here, the West and the South, Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, are going to be for war. The Doves are the people against war. Generally, this is the Federalists. They're going to be represented by Daniel Webster here of Massachusetts, who's going to be one of the strongest voices against the war. And in general, as we can see in the election of 1812, we have a fusion of anti-war Republicans and Federalists that come actually somewhat close to challenging the massive amount of Democratic-Republican dominance that we've seen throughout this entire unit. And so the issue of the war is a polarizing and divisive one, and in general the areas that benefit from trade and the areas along the coast are against the war, whereas the backcountry areas and the south are generally for the war. And so we see a sort of divide along what used to be Federalist Republican lines, but also there's some Democratic Republicans, especially in New York, against the war. So there's our results in 1812, which means we're going to war. We issue this declaration of war with England. Like all wars, this is a super complicated fight. We're going to try to simplify it into the war in the West, the war around D.C., and then the war in the South. But there's lots of other confrontations, and we're leaving stuff out. And if you're interested, you can go and find other resources to fill in all the gaps. I'm just going to simplify it as much as possible to try to tell a cohesive and satisfying narrative. So here's how the war unfolded. We declare war on England, and for the most part, they ignore us. This is again at the height of the Napoleonic War. The Peninsular War in the Iberian Peninsula is raging. Napoleon is launching his invasion of Russia, and the coalition is preparing to fight Napoleon to the death on the continent. And so the British have larger concerns than their former colony declaring war on them. And so we're really not going to see much of a British response, at least in the early phases. The war in the north is for the control over these forts in the northern Ohio River Valley, and specifically our multiple invasions of Canada. One of the goals of the War of 1812, sort of the unstated goals, was a potential annexation of Canada. We were hoping to complete the thing that we failed to do during the Revolutionary War and seize the rest of the British territory on the continent. And so we felt like, while England was distracted, this might be an excellent opportunity to try to get more territory in the north. Unfortunately, this does not go super well. Early on, we are able to successfully invade Canada. We take the capital of Canada, what is today Toronto, but what was then called York, and we accidentally burn it to the ground, or intentionally burn it to the ground, depending on who you talk to. We definitely intentionally looted the city, and then it caught fire, and capital of Canada gone. Unfortunately for us, we're unable to follow up on this victory because of a lack of logistics. We don't have the resources to move supplies from our manufacturing areas on the East Coast into the Ohio River Valley and especially across the Great Lakes. And so this is a huge logistical nightmare for us. We don't have military control over the Great Lakes either. The British control them. And so getting supplies to support our troops ends up being impossible, and we have to abandon the burned out British capital, and we can't effectively follow up on our victory. We do, however, build a small fleet and challenge British dominance on Lake Erie. This Battle of Lake Erie, we've got Oliver Hazard Perry here, our Commodore, who very bravely, we build this fleet and we take on a approximate-sized British fleet. When his flagship is damaged, he jumps into a rowboat and rows across to take command of another ship, and we're able to isolate and destroy the British forces on Lake Erie. This gives us military control over the Great Lakes and is the last battle fought on the Great Lakes. From here on out, they are going to be demilitarized. It also allows us to move our troops freely around the northern sort of theater and bring Tecumseh to a decisive battle at the Battle of the Thames. Our forces meet a joint British and Native American force, again at the Battle of the Thames, trapping the Native Americans between a swamp on one side and a river on the other. And so because we're able to bring them to decisive combat, William Henry Harrison's forces are able to defeat the natives, and Tecumseh himself is killed in the conflict, forever ending the risk of a massive pan-Native American alliance pushing back on our westward expansion. From here on out, the war goes much, much, much more poorly for us. We fail to recruit enough troops to be able to follow up on the Battle of the Thames. New England specifically refuses to provide aid or support for the war, and very few New Englanders actually join the forces. There's a push for maybe trying to conscript people, but of course, at this point, that would be unconstitutional, and so we do not pass any type of conscription. And in 1814, Napoleon is defeated, and so now the British Army is freed up from its continental adventures, and they're prepared to counterattack. This is absolutely devastating for the United States because England has a extremely well-trained and effective army honed by years of fighting on the European continent. And so to say that we're not ready to fight the British, main regular army is a massive, massive understatement. Here we go. Daniel Webster gives this speech against the war, trying to push back on any attempt to again create a regular army or draft people into it. And the English are able to almost uncontestedly take Washington, D.C. and burn it to the ground. So, Washington, D.C., in revenge for the burning of Toronto, Canada, is burned. James Madison is forced to flee. Dolly Madison famously saves a picture of George Washington, from the White House as the British put it to the torch. But the British advance inward is stymied when at Fort McHenry, through the rocket's red glare in the morning, our flag is still there, and we end up slowing the British down enough that their advance inward bogs down and they don't take Baltimore. So the British do take our capital, but our government is able to flee. And with this dire situation, New England convenes what's called the Hartford Convention, that issues a series of demands to the U.S. government and even considers seceding from the Union if the war continues. This is going to be a massive embarrassment to the New Englanders, especially after what's going to happen next. So keep in mind, Hartford Convention, these are New England extremists who were thinking of negotiating a separate peace with England, potentially. And then the war ends, for really no reason. The war was fought over impressment and the fear of a Native American alliance. The fears of impressment are over with the Napoleonic Wars being over, and with Tecumseh dead, there's no real fear of a British Native American alliance, and so the son of John Adams, John Quincy Adams, negotiates a ceasefire, and we return to status quo antebellum. Everything that was true before the war becomes true after the war. And so the War of 1812 sort of ends with a whimper, except it totally doesn't, because the Hartford Convention is massively humiliating for New Englanders because John Quincy Adams ends the war right about the time that the Federalists might be thinking about jumping back into the King's loving embrace or seceding from the nation. And so this is going to be the death knell for federalism, and the Federalist Party is not going to survive their lack of faith in the War of 1812. And there's still a war going on in the South, specifically. And this is sometimes talked about as a separate war, but to me it makes sense to talk about it in the context of the War of 1812. The Creek peoples are pushing back on settlement into the Mississippi Territory. We talked about the subdivision of this land and their sale through the whole Yazoo land fraud thing. But Native American chiefs, of course, like always, were not consulted in the sale of their lands, and so they're launching attacks on settlers. There's also a battle between the Upper Creek tribes and the Lower Creek tribes. It's a whole complicated thing that, again, if you're really interested in, go read more. It's fascinating. But we're going to oversimplify and say the Creek people were pushing back on American westward expansion. Andrew Jackson is a farmer and slave trader from Tennessee. Grew up in Virginia. We're going to spend much more time with Andrew Jackson and his backstory later, so I'm just going to name drop him quick. But he's going to lead a group of Tennessee militiamen to fight the Creek War and eventually defeat the Native Americans at the decisive Battle of Horseshoe Bend here. And so they are going to be defeated, and the Creek War is brought to a close. And then the most famous battle of the war, which the war is already over, as we mentioned, happens. The British had already launched an invasion fleet to try to take back the port of New Orleans. The Americans were unable to stop them from landing effectively, and so the British are able to land and prepare to assault the city. But Andrew Jackson comes south and takes command of American troops and wins probably the most decisive one-sided victory in American history thus far. Despite the fact that he was outnumbered probably 2-1, Jackson's sharpshooters managed to repel multiple British attacks on his fortifications and are able to drive back a substantially larger force of the British regular army by positioning themselves behind a canal and some defenses. This one-sided defeat both demonstrates that the American troops are capable of fighting against British regulars and establishes Andrew Jackson as perhaps our greatest war hero since George Washington. Jackson from here on out becomes Old Hickory, the hero of New Orleans, and his stature amongst his American countrymen is massively, massively improved. The fact that the battle was not important at all and that it was fought after the war was concluded is somewhat irrelevant because in the end, it boosted American pride and really changed the way that we felt about the war. Up until this point, the war is kind of a mixed bag for the United States. Yes, we killed Tecumseh, we burned the British capital of Canada, but we also lost our capital in the process. And once the British actually started fighting, we didn't perform particularly well. But the Battle of New Orleans and the death of Tecumseh combined together really make us start feeling like this is a true American victory. We've eliminated barriers to westward expansion, both by defeating British forces and defeating the largest Native Americans groups who were pushing back. The Uss Constitution, one of our ships, defeated a British ship on the high seas, making the Constitution one of the most famous ships in American history, famous enough to the point where it's still anchored in Boston Harbor, where you can go visit it if you want. The Constitution became known as Old Ironsides because British cannonballs were bouncing off its sides during the battle, and we were able to, again, capture one of the ships of the vaunted British Navy on the high seas, which was very impressive. And so, in general, the effect of this is we felt as if we had really decisively defeated the British in a way that we hadn't since the Battle of Yorktown or the Battle of Saratoga. Here we see James Madison punching the King of England in his face as the Constitution defeats a British ship on the high seas. And so this builds a sense of American pride, nationalism, and independence, really completing the American independence movement that had started way back at the First Continental Congress, or maybe even the Stamp Act Congress. The other thing this convinces us, and we'll spend much more time talking about this on Thursday, is for the United States, we had been dependent up to this point on foreign trade, but the 30 years of warfare in Europe showed us the danger of not developing our infrastructure and our industry. And so even Federalists who had previously been opposed to the development of industry now saw the necessity of it because Europe is going to be this unstable powder keg. And if we're forever going to be tied to Europe for our financial stability, we're totally going to be at the mercy of whoever the next Napoleon is and whatever conflict he then establishes. So that brings us to the close for the War of 1812. Next time we're gonna move into the era of good feelings and talk about to what extent there was political consensus after the War of 1812. But for now, we'll leave you here. Hopefully you can answer these questions in some detail. Thank you for listening.